Hey folks, we're going to try something a little bit different today. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about a theory about how to identify business models that are more or less going off into the wrong direction with a really easy and simple heuristic on how businesses operate. And I'm going to call this business complexity theory. And it's going to look like something like this. Like any good, you know, pseudo business idea, it starts with, two-sided graph. And on one side, we're going to talk about models, like a business model, for example, grocery store chain or maybe selling, computer hardware, whatever. And we're going to break this up into, a binary. I'm going to say up here, these are good business models. So what would be a good business model? This would be like I'm going to sell groceries to hungry people in my area. That would be a good business model. That's an area, it's a business I want to be in long term. But let's say now we have a bad business model down here. So we have good up here, now we got bad. And bad says I want to sell ice to Eskimos who don't have any money. Or I want to sell, the spoiled food for people, whatever it is. It's just a model that's just bad, here. And that's on this side here. But then we're going to compare that to the other model, which is complexity. We're going to call this complexity. And we're going to say this is low complexity, where it's low, it's easy to understand, or there's not a lot of moving parts. And this can be defined by, just how many traits are required to explain the business, or how, simple it is to kind of explain. So like good but simple is, a grocery chain. We sell high-end groceries to local communities in the New York area. That's a pretty low complexity idea. But then let's say we have a high complexity business model. And we say this one over here is okay, we have a ton of traits that are required to explain the business. We have to go through and say, well, okay, you need to understand like, the market, and the space, how many subsections subgroups we're talking about, and there's particular characteristics that we sell to, and there's particular products. Basically, just a lot of complexity to describe it, just a lot going on there. And you can kind of go through these four different quadrants, and we could kind of go through and say, well, what's a good model below complexity and good model high complexity? But there's actually something going on here that I think is really important and where the business complexity theory comes in. Let's talk about really good business models that are simple. What ends up happening is you get an idea here that is easy to explain and is actually good. It's easy to defend, it's easy to go through, and you're able to get an idea that's of what it's supposed to do, and it's not too hard. And a lot of businesses fall into that. You might think of some businesses that are super complex. Maybe you wouldn't call it low complexity, but there's a lot going on where it's like that's not easy to explain. But most good models you should be able to throw in there and say, okay, there's a low level complexity. But what about bad and low complexity? What type of business fits into that model? Well, you might say something like just a terrible idea on what happens there. Like, for example, like I go out and I say, I'm going to go right in front of my house and I'm going to sell bananas to the cars driving by. That's a low complexity idea, but how many things do you think I could sell under that model? How many people over here, we'll change my color here, how many people do you think I can sell to? Well, chances are not very many. I'm not going to have that much foot traffic. I'm just a dude selling bananas, on the side of my street. That seems kind of like a hard model to go into, starting to do that. And this is where I started to notice something about the way models work. It's a business model that is good and low complexity is easy to explain. But let's talk about these guys, but a bad model down here actually really, really has trouble existing. Oh, whoops. Go back to my pen here. There we go. Sorry about that. So let's talk about what ends up happening when it goes from, a bad low complexity. Well, the truth is it's really easy to see that this is a bad model. I can have something that's bad, but it ends up being here and it's like, no, we know this isn't going to work. We know this is a bad model. You know, don't give us to this or whatever. So the truth is at the end of the day, there's a lot of good low complexity models and almost virtually no bad low complexity models. Because what happens here? Well, over time, what ends up happening is if you have a bad low complexity model, it ends up getting more complex over time. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you have a startup, which are many, and they have a business plan in front of you, and they say, "Oh, okay, we are going to, sell, social media advertising, or we're going to sell like, I'm going to be an Instagram model, for example. I'm going to get lots of people who are interested in vegan activism, and I'm going to get them interested in Instagram." And good idea, bad idea, whatever. There's some ideas there. But then you go through and see its local, maybe it's not successful. That maybe I'm giving a following, but I'm not selling something. Well, then what ends up happening? Well, they could just admit, yeah, you're right. That's a shit idea. I need to change the idea a little bit or you can add complexity. You can say the base idea doesn't change, but instead I'm going to say that, oh, we just don't know enough information yet. We don't really know what's going on here. We're saying that, oh, it's because I'm in the wrong season, for example, that really is a good idea, but I need to, or I just haven't found the right customers, so the right thing. So instead of just saying, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to sell, and it's going to work, now all of a sudden I'm saying, okay, great, I'm going to have more things going on. So high complexity ends up going to the side here, and the truth is the complexity hides how bad it is. So you go from knowing it's bad to saying like, oh, maybe there's a few more details out there I haven't quite understood. Maybe there's a few more details I don't quite know out there and doing that. But then once those get proven, you might say, oh, maybe it's, I thought it would be go to a good season. Like maybe, if I posted at night, for example, is there. Now I'm going to post on some different time. Or maybe Instagram isn't the right model. So this is a good idea, but I need to post someplace else. All of a sudden it just goes and the complexity raises and raises to hide the bad model. So what about high complexity and a good model? Well, what ends up happening here is you also have a lot of extra details in the business, but it's a good model. So you have a lot of complexity. There's a lot of details to say, oh, okay, I'm selling to people, money's clearly coming, but I have all these details about the business that I know there that I have to sell to people in this particular market and area, whatever, blah, blah, blah. It might go to high complexity, but over time, what's going to happen is the business is going to simplify. What do I mean by that? Well, as a business scales and gets bigger and bigger, it's going to shed the unnecessary elements of that business. They have a bunch of ideas, but the truth is that there's going to be some bad ideas along with it, and some of them are going to be necessary. So what that business is going to do naturally is that once it gets going and it finds a model that works, it's going to start shedding out those elements that don't really work for the business. They're going to start going there and say, well, that doesn't work. Timing really doesn't matter that much. It's really, the location that really matters. And oh, maybe, I have a menu item that's, has a lot of items. Maybe I'm going to simplify it to little. Or maybe having a lot of items works for me, but I'm going to simplify how I cook the process and cook the food to be able to do that. So ultimately, what's happening is it's getting simpler and simpler till eventually you get to a really, really simple business model. And the truth is, for every major good organization that you see out there, no matter how big, the organization might have a lot of complexity in it, but the business model is really simple. Apple sells hardware, and all the software it does is in support of selling the hardware. It's a really simple business model. Not easy, but it's simple. You have even companies as complex as Palantir, which is this data science behemoth, deals with these crazy technologies and crazy ideas. At the end of the day, their business model is we sell data science and data science products to federal government, the US federal government and major organizations. That's a business model that gets around. So this, tying this all together, this is what business complexity theory says. It says that good business models over time are going to trend towards simplicity. They're going to trend towards simplicity. They're not going to get more complex. They're going to get less complex over time as a business figure out, and they're going to trend in this direction. They're going to trend towards simple. But bad business models over time are going to trend towards complexity. Because while a good model has nothing it needs to hide because it's a good model and it's making money, a bad business model is going to have to get more complex to be able to hide the fact that it's not making money. They have to go and explain to their stakeholders why there's problems. They have to go issues. And the easiest way to do that is not to say, I screwed up. It is to say, there's just some complexity we don't quite understand yet. So we just have to keep adding these details over and over again to do that. And so you can use this in your life to go and analyze businesses. If you see that over time they're getting more simple and that they're getting easier, and the simplicity is leading to an increase in funds, and the money's going in the right direction, and all the metrics are trending in the right direction, and the business model is getting simpler, you know it's going in the right direction. Versus a bad business model that's just floundering will get more and more complicated without going the other direction. And the truth is, a bad business model can flip into a good business model eventually. It can flip here where you get enough of the ideas where eventually they move to the state where there are some good ideas, but there are some bad ideas as well. But what happens then? Well, the good ideas will come in. Get my pen back here. The good ideas will come back in, they'll simplify, and it'll go to good. So, when you're really confused by a business, when there seems to be a lot of details going on there, and there doesn't seem to be any clarity, and every time there's a failure, instead of explaining it away, you add another question, another detail, something else is there, you might just be in a bad business because ultimately all the business models should trend towards simple.